Hello and welcome. I'm Diane Okonski, your host for today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the INLUS members and donors for their contributions that make our webinars and classes, scholarships, and grants possible. If you'd like to learn more about the INLUS, including membership, please look at our website, inlus.org. For today's program, we encourage you to submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will answer as many as possible throughout the program. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website and YouTube channel. So let's get started, and let me introduce you to our presenters, Jenna Sciuto and Amber Engelson. Jenna Grace Sciuto is a professor of English at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. She received her BA from Brown University, MA from Boston University, and PhD from Northeastern University. Her first two books, Intersecting Worlds, Colonial Liminality in U.S. Southern and Icelandic Literatures, published in 2025, and Policing Intimacy, Law, Sexuality, and the Color Line in the 20th Century Hemispheric American Literature, published in 2021, focus on colonialism's lingering impacts on identity, intimacy, and family dynamics across Icelandic, U.S. Southern, and Caribbean literatures, respectively. Her work has also appeared in Ariel, the Faulkner Journal, the Global South, and the Journal of Commonwealth and Postcolonial Studies, as well as the collections of Faulkner and Black Literatures of the Americas, Southern Comforts, Drinking in the U.S. South, and the new William Faulkner series. She will be returning to Iceland this summer as a writer in residence at the Gunnar Gunnarsson House in Eastern Iceland. Amber Engelson is currently professor of English and writer and director of writing at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, where she teaches courses in first-year writing, transnational feminist rhetorics, global comparative rhetorics, and writing center theory and praxis. Her first book, The Hands of God at Work, Islamic Gender Justice Through Translingual Praxis, was just published by NCTE's Studies in Writing and Rhetoric series. Her work has also appeared in college English, literacy and composition studies, and various edited collections. Wow. Well, welcome to Jenna and Amber. It's so nice to have you with us. And Jenna, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and you can take it for the rest of the program.
Sweet. Okay. Hi. Thank you to Diane and Doug, to also David, Rob, Ricky, everyone who has worked to put this together and publicize it, and of course my colleague and friend, Dr. Amber Engelson, for joining me. I'm Dr. Jenna Grace Sciuto, professor of global Anglophone literature, coming to you from Western Massachusetts, and I'm very excited to introduce you to my second book today, Intersecting Worlds, Colonial Liminality in U.S. Southern and Icelandic Literatures. Before Amber and I will engage in some brief discussion, and I'll end with a more general discussion of Icelandic literature in translation, with some recommendations for you all. So let's get going. Okay. My book, Intersecting Worlds, examines the lingering impacts of layered colonial histories common to Iceland and the U.S. South, primarily as depicted through literature. And I analyzed the works of some of the writers on my slide, William Faulkner, Carson McCullers, for instance, from the U.S. South, Caribbean American writer Tiffany Yannick, Halldór Laxness, Svava Jakobsdóttir, Guðbjörg Bergson from Iceland. And this book really intends to recalibrate readings of U.S. Southern and American writers by resituating them on global scales and exploring comparable depictions of race, colonialism, gender, and sexuality in Icelandic literature. So on October 12, 1955, U.S. Southern writer William Faulkner arrived in Iceland as a 5-day program, part of the State Department effort to broadcast U.S. cultural achievements internationally. And the visit occurred against the backdrop of widespread discontent regarding the U.S. military base at Keflavik. Faulkner was known for his distrust of the government, his, quote, deep anxiety over the inexorable growth of military-industrial capitalism, which is apparent in his fiction. But nevertheless, as an ambassador, When asked about the U.S. military's presence in Iceland, Faulkner responded, quote, "Neither of our nations is responsible for the circumstances that caused American forces to be here," reminding people that the troops were not there under the auspices of the U.S., but NATO, and that, quote, "American soldiers are young men far from their own country who do not like being so far from their families." So while his work for the government then positioned him more on the side of the US military in this instance, there's an anti-colonial undercurrent that runs through many of his novels that has a very different effect. So this trip serves perhaps as a link between Faulkner, the ambassador, and Iceland, the Nordic nation, resisting neocolonial associations. But then I ask what other multi-layered ties might exist between Faulkner, the modernist writer writing out of defeat, the defeat of the US South, and Icelandic novelists reflecting on, responding to their own unique colonial situations. So Intersecting Worlds demonstrates that we must read these Norths and Souths in comparison or risk leaving localized stereotypes, fantasies, conceptualizations of whiteness uninterrogated. So I've really tried to zero in on these liminal in-between spaces and see what light can be shed on intersecting Northern and Southern histories. So this is a copy of a saga published by Iceland's Nobel laureate, who, don't worry, we'll return to, Halldór Laxness, that was gifted to Faulkner during the 1955 visit. And it's a beautiful illustrated version. But the most interesting thing is it's been inscribed to Faulkner and signed by numerous Icelandic writers. And one Norwegian that you can see about the middle of the page, who I think really wanted Faulkner to know he was Norwegian. He writes Oslo, Norway, lectured in Norwegian. But other names, you might, Elias Mars on there, Einar Bragi. So yeah, just a pretty cool artifact linking these spaces through literature. This, I've been quoting from this document. It's the dispatch describing the State Department visit in detail and kind of what the outcomes were, which were overall seen as positive. But this one is my favorite. You can see it's titled, quote, "Secret," up at the top. It's a secret memo. And it describes the Icelanders' knowledge of their role in this cultural tug of war between the US and Russia. And notes kind of in that blurb towards the middle, it says, quote, "One William Faulkner is worth in Iceland innumerable lesser lights." So already speaking to the respect that Icelanders had for Faulkner's work previous to the visit. So I explore the effects of the experience of colonization on spaces that weren't directly annexed through the colonial project. And there's more specific theory on my slide if you want to get deeper into it. But pretty much these countries, these regions, they were never officially colonized or colonizers. Yet aspects of post-colonial theory still resonate, and I believe can elucidate interesting elements of these histories, both Iceland and the US South. So I'm particularly interested in this liminality, this ambiguity, and just the general unease that may result from post-colonial theories being applied to these two spaces. I investigate the parallels, but also the limitations to such comparisons. So the labels, the binaries created to represent colonial dynamics, colonizer, colonized, global north, global south, these don't really fit the liminal in-between positionings of Iceland and the US South. And I argue that ignoring this complexity really just flattens the relationships within, but also between these spaces. So just a little more. Applying, one thing I have to make sure to clarify is that when we do apply post-colonial theories to Nordic spaces like Iceland, it's important to note the history of Iceland and its geopolitical positioning differ from other nations' colonial experiences. For instance, Denmark had colonies in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean. And as Christine Lofstoder has mentioned, there was brutal violence, various dehumanizing practices, exterminations that were just a part of people's everyday lives in these other colonies that was not equivalent to what was happening with Iceland. And yet there is some good research comparing the Nordic nations' colonial experiences of oppression and humiliation under Danish rule that I think invites some comparisons with other formerly colonized spaces. So I think the comparison holds, but we have to be really careful not to conflate the differences that we see as well. If you can't tell, Christine Lofstadter is one of my favorite scholars. She's an anthropologist in Iceland, and she's demonstrated that while Iceland was ruled by Norway and later was a dependency of Denmark, Icelanders also employed racist stereotypes of colonized people to attempt to differentiate themselves from other colonies and also to claim whiteness. So, kind of, we are white and European. We're not like folks in the other colonies. And I argue that a focus on this whiteness illuminates Iceland's ambivalent coloniality. Iceland's positioning. So here's where the U.S. South connects to the colonial ambiguity of the U.S. South that's also been written about. A region depicted in literature as, quote, colonized by the U.S. federal government during Reconstruction, but also the site of the colonization of the Black population through the system of enslavement and its later iterations. So building then on the notion of Iceland's colonial duality, I explore the ways in which Iceland both benefited from its colonial relationships, but also was negatively impacted. For instance, its relationship to Denmark and later the US, and the central roles of whiteness, quote, civilization, Nordic identity in this liminality. So yeah, the book pretty much explores these intersections of identity, racial dynamics, gender diversity, queerness that span these novels and focus on the negative impacts of colonization, but also resistance to these impositions from society. So that is my little overview. And I'd like to invite my colleague and friend, Dr. Amber Engelson, author of Hands of God at Work, into discussion with me.
Well, thank you, Jenna, for inviting me to your talk. It's my pleasure to engage in dialogue with everyone here. A few years back, Jenna and I were lucky to be on sabbatical at the same time, and we were working on our books the same time. My first one and Jenna's second, which is what she's talking about now. And it was a pleasure to talk about this book as it progressed from an idea to a draft to the real thing during our many long snowshoe walks in the Berkshires. And Jenna, I'm happy to pick your brain some more tonight. So let's get started. So first, let's talk about how your book works to shift our lenses when it comes to hemispheric space. So why Iceland and why the US South? Like, what commonalities do these spaces share?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably in the forefront of many people's minds hearing the title. But yeah, the short answer, because of these complexities within their colonial histories. So the book explores how conversations about colonialism shift when we include a far north location like Iceland, disrupting conventional understandings of space, complicating geographic inflections of power, as you were alluding to, Amber. So yeah, I think, for instance, if we think of the so-called global South, the framing of countries in the Southern Hemisphere as marginalized in comparison with the, quote, global North, this becomes more complicated, disrupted even when we think of a space like the far North. So another marginalized space, often thought of as devoid of people, an Arctic wasteland. So I'm really interested in destabilizing these assumptions about space, about power. Yeah, but why Iceland and the US South in particular also? I think incorporating these Norths and Souths as opposed to maybe other colonial peripheries just underscores this challenge to dominant spatial configurations. So if space is considered to be at disparate ends of the globe, have these commonalities, perhaps we need to reevaluate how we think about, how we talk about the global impacts of colonization.
Awesome, excellent. So drawing from that, could you speak a little more specifically as to what you mean by colonial liminality in relation to these spaces? So what is colonial liminality?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it is pretty central to my argument that this focus on colonial liminality is connecting. It's the important link between the US and Iceland and across these literatures, revealing much about their overlapping histories, I guess. But liminality, if we think of that term as referring to in-betweenness, to maybe a threshold area, then I use colonial liminality to look at the space in between the polarized positions of colonizer, colonize, opening up other forms of liminality, of yeah, the in-betweenness, again, this threshold area. And the book opens from there, I think, to also consider gender, sexuality, race in terms of this more flexible liminal configuration. And honestly, so as a white passing multiracial person myself, I'm a quarter Japanese. I've got other liminal aspects to my identity, and I've always been drawn to these in-between spaces, what it feels like when language doesn't really fit, the labels don't really seem to fit, and just getting beyond these categories. So I guess I'm drawn to that in my research as well.
Well, thank you. Could you walk us through your chapters? So what writers and what themes are you focusing on in your book?
Yes, I was anticipating this. So I think I'll put my slide, if I can, back up so you can follow along. Yeah, and I do have some notes for this one in case. Yeah. So you can see the chapter titles there. And the first chapter, Returning to Haldor Laxness, examines how the U.S. South and Iceland depict ways that language is used to hierarchize bodies through distinctions of race, class, gender, and attempt to protect the position of white upper class men. So Haldor Laxness is the Atom Station, which I'll talk more about in a minute. William Faulkner's Absalon Absalon, as well as work by Svava Jakobsdottir. And then chapter 2 analyzes portrayals of racial violence, exclusion, like self-annihilating forms of whiteness that center kind of the white male perspective and erase Black biracial characters' experiences, again in Faulkner and here in Guthberg Bergson. But then I'm interested in how that erasure is undone in something like Jean Toomer's Cain, a Southern novel that does focus and center more on Black and biracial experiences. But Bergson, for just a one point of connection here, represents the historical agreement that Iceland had with the US government that there should be, if there were to be this military base, there would be no Black soldiers that could be stationed in Iceland, which actually continued unofficially into the 60s. So speaking to some of these underlying structures of white supremacy there. In chapter 3, it's become one of my favorites. I think we've talked about this one a lot, Amber, but yeah. It's exploring more the gendered aspects, gender nonconformity, characters who don't really fit in with expected gender roles, with Laxness's Salka Valka and Carson McCullers' novels. And then finally, chapter 4 is building from the idea that colonization linked parts of the globe that maybe otherwise wouldn't be connected. So if you think of the Danish colonies, St. Thomas in the former Danish West Indies, Iceland, don't seem to have a lot of connections, but I wanted to zero in on that and see how two novels in particular show multiple generations of women and their own forms of power, magic, and beauty that combine. So it's Tiffany Yannick and Fritha Sigurdsdottir with links to Gail Jones there. Yeah.
Very cool. So you're focusing mostly on 20th century literature. Does our present period factor into your analysis at all?
Yeah. So one note, the copy edits were due September 2024. So not this exact moment, which I think would be even more, the stakes are even higher now. But I do try to emphasize in the coda the slide's still up, so you can see that a little bit too, that neither space had effectively addressed its colonial histories. And so the ripples of this are still felt in our present period. For instance, with the climate crisis, with the race for Arctic resources, as well as anti-immigrant sentiments, cis heteronormative expectations, all of these aspects, experiences of women, queer communities, and that if we really want to understand the present moment and hopefully a more decolonial future, we have to look to the past as well. And I think I just saw in the news today that I know Finland and Denmark were issuing travel advisories for trans travelers coming to the U.S. and Iceland was considering doing similar aspects. So right now, I mean, Greenland too, with kind of Greenland's precarious position due to this race for resources. And I think it's just become more heightened and this discussion.
Yeah. So Jenna, where can we find a copy of this book?
Yeah. Favorite slide. One is that I do have a discount code to offer listeners or attendants as well for 30% off through the University of Mississippi's website. You can find it there, but you can also find it other websites, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org. Thrift Books is one of my favorites, Amazon. But just feel free, if you're interested, to request it from your local library as well. That helps out writers. And as my niece demonstrates here, it makes a great gift for any young infants in your life. Keep it in mind.
Cute. So one last question. You've already published 2 books. What projects are you now working on?
Yeah, so kind of starting a new project with my frequent collaborator in Iceland, Viktor Ingvarsson at the University of Iceland, who's a poet, a writer, also a scholar. We're looking at how Southern Gothic tropes and forms in Icelandic literature, yeah, just the history of that. Has always historically been a strong interest in Poe and Edgar Allan Poe's works there. But we're going to focus on Gunnar Gunnarsson's 7 Days of Darkness and Schoen's Moonstone, that if any of my students are here, we read recently. These were written nearly a century apart, but they both take place in Iceland in 1918, which was a big year. It was the year Iceland was, yeah, the backdrop of World War I, the outbreak of the Spanish flu, the volcano Katla also erupted. And we argue that this setting infuses Southern Gothic forms into Icelandic novels. So yeah, and that's why I'm back. Diane mentioned I'll be writer in resident at the Gunnar Gunnarsson Institute working on that project this summer. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, Amber. And yeah, should I go back to the slide? Here's Amber's book too, came out last year. Yeah, Hands of God at Work, Islamic Gender Justice through Translingual Praxis. So, okay, now the moment I've been waiting for, at least, where I get to talk a lot about awesome books. Yeah, I believe many in the audience share my interest in Icelandic culture and literature. So I'll end today with just some favorite writers that I've discovered through doing this work with books available in English translation. So if you've heard of any one Icelandic writer, there's a decent chance it's the man on the screen right now, Halldór Laxness, born Halldór Guðjónsson in Reykjavik, before his family moved out to Laxness Farm, where he got his pen name from. So prolific writer of novels, poetry, essays, among other genres. He lived in the U.S. in the late 1920s and attempted to break into Hollywood as a screenwriter, but he didn't have a lot of success at that. William Faulkner did the same and had a bit more success, but Laxness also won the Nobel Prize in 1955, which just happens to be the same year that Faulkner was knighted that we discussed earlier. So you might wonder, which Laxness novel do I start with? So many good options. Independent People is, of course, a classic. Gives a richly descriptive sense of the life of stubborn sheep farmer Bjartur of Summer Houses. It's a novel of epic proportions, fascinating character dynamics, a strong sense of rural life in the early 20th century in Iceland. But I will say at 512 pages, it's not for the faint of heart and might be a challenging entry point for, let's say, the less than motivated out there. And yeah, if you self-identify in that category, the less than motivated, I'd recommend maybe coming back to Independent People. Perhaps check out The Atom Station first. It's significantly shorter, 200 pages, and it's Laxness's Cold War novel. So kind of interesting from a U.S. reader's perspective, focusing in on the backdrop of the 1946 treaty involving the U.S. military base at Keflavik and referred to as selling the country to the Americans. So yeah, one reason I love it too is its strong-willed heroine, Ugla, which means owl, who comes from the north to be the maid for a family in Reykjavik. So yeah, it's a good one. But probably my favorite is Salka coming of age novel focusing on a small Icelandic fishing village. And Salka herself is a literary icon, a role model for generations of girls and women in Iceland, as I've been told by my Icelandic friends. So she's a peculiar character, a young tomboy who really interests me in the way that she defies gender expectations. She infamously wears pants pretty much throughout her life and becomes a leader in her community that way. But I can go on and on, so I'll stop there and move on to Svava Jakobsdóttir, feminist politician and writer. She was the focus of my archival research at Ánestofnun in Reykjavik last summer. And I think I'd recommend Gunnlaug's Tale. In part, unfortunately, the Lodger and other stories is harder to get. I think it's out of print right now. But the stories do focus on U.S. military presence, gender dynamics, commodity culture in Iceland. So if you can find them, or you can borrow my copy, they're pretty good too. But Gunnlaug's Tale takes place in 1980s in Copenhagen primarily, and focuses on the relationship between a mother and daughter. But the novel also rewrites an important scene from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. In Svava's version, Gunnlaug is not a foolish giantess, the keeper of the mead of poetry, who Odin easily seduces and takes advantage of. But here she's a priestess, embodying an earth goddess with power and agency over their encounter. So it's pretty fascinating. And that's a portrait of Gunnlaug. Yes, and born in the same year as Svava, we have Austa Sigurdsdóttir, positioned as more of a bohemian on the fringes of society. She wrote stories, poetry, created art, modeled for artists, and Nothing to be Rescued is her first collection in English, published in 2023 with her original images. You can see one on the cover. And there's also an image of the Icelandic folklore deck that she created in the 60s, which I think you can even buy in the, what is it, the Grapevine website. Not that I'm plugging that, but yeah. All right, the moment we've all been waiting for, the Nordic Noir interlude. Woo! Yeah, so I'm starting with who sometimes referred to as King and Queen of Icelandic Noir, and I believe rightly so. We have Arnaldur Indriðason and Yrsa Sigurdsdóttir, with Ragnar Jónasson perhaps as the prince, and we'll come back to him. But I'd say you really can't go wrong with these two. I'd recommend perhaps starting with the first books in their most prominent series. So you have Jar City, which is a darker noir, got some of that trademark noir gloom, kicking off the Detective Erlander series that does share some vibes perhaps to Henning Mankell's Wallander series for fans of that. And the characters, the relationships are just really well developed. The series has a lot of heart, in my opinion. And Yrsa, I'd start with Last Rituals, flirts with the supernatural because it focuses on the murder of a witchcraft-obsessed student. But the novel's firmly grounded in reality, with lawyer Thora Gudmundsson on the case. And there's some interesting chemistry between the two leads that really propels the novel forward. And it involves a road trip to one of my favorite spots, might see this coming, but the Museum of Icelandic Sorcery and Witchcraft in Holmavik, which I highly recommend. It has great vegan soup options as well, if you're interested in that. Okay, back to the prince, Ragnar Jónasson. Yeah, I'd say maybe starting with Snowblind. I think that is a pretty tightly written mystery, takes place in Siglufjörður up north, and has been compared to Agatha Christie, whom Ragnar actually has translated into Icelandic, so you see where that comes from. But it also kicks off, I think it's the Ari Thor series. And just because I think it's cool that the former Prime Minister, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, has co-written with Ragnar Reykjavik, a crime story. And if that fact isn't novel enough, it also takes place on the small island of Viðey, which you can see from the Reykjavik harbor. Also makes a great day trip if you haven't been. But so I don't too much on tourist recommendations. Now we'll move right along to Sjón, whose pen name means sight in English. She's a poet, a novelist, screenwriter. You can see one of his most recent films, The Northman, on my slide there. He was a member of the Medusa Group, a surrealist art collective active in the late 70s, mid 80s. A collaborator of Bjork, and probably Iceland's best known living contemporary writer, perhaps. You know, you can argue with me in the Q&A perhaps on that. I'd recommend Moonstone, which is the novel I mentioned that takes place in 1918. And it's told through the perspective of a gay teenager on the outskirts of society during that really interesting year in Iceland. And this character really just inhabits the world through international cinema. So it makes an interesting read. The Blue Fox is another great one to start with, I think. The lyrical mystery and contemporary folklore of sorts. But yeah, can't go wrong. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all these in depth. There's too many, but I just wanted to shout out a few quickly. Oither Avr Olafsdatters, the Olafsdatters, The Green House, is a poignant book about the value of the small things in life. So that I definitely recommend. Odni Ayres, The Land of Love and Ruins. It's a pretty poetic, moving book on love, independence, our relationship to the earth. I've mentioned Thomas Jonsson's bestseller. It's in one of my chapters, and I'm conflicted about recommending it. It's a modernist classic and has a lot of weight and value, but it's very experimental. It's in the form of notebooks of this cantankerous old man. So knowing that, it's a bit of a challenge to get through his notebooks, but I think worth it. Frithia Sigurdsdottir's Night Watch, I had talked about too. The beautiful layered story about our relationship to the past, to previous generations, and taking place in remote Hornstrandir, though out of print, and you can borrow my copy again if you can't find it. Yeah, and it's not up here, but I literally just finished Jon Kalman Stephenson's Your Absence is Darkness, and yeah, it's a beautiful book as well. But I just wanted to end because I believe some of my friends in my Icelandic class and also reading group are here by shouting out two dual language poetry books, Storm Warning by Christine Svava Tomasdottir and Bloodhoof by Gerther Kristni, which are both powerful works and really great for language learners because it's printed with both English and Icelandic on alternative pages. But I will end there. Hopefully, you have enough to start with.
Well, thank you so much, Jenna and Amber. That was very interesting. And we do have some questions that have come in. So the first one is, what spurred your interest in the Denmark-Iceland relationship and exploring Icelandic literature in this regard?
That's a great question. Yeah, let me think how it started. I think it happened actually early in the COVID-19 pandemic. I had applied for a grant to go to Iceland because I had been there twice as a tourist. And during the pandemic, I just kind of holed up and I was reading lots of Icelandic literature. I didn't know where to start though, which is one reason I wanted to end my presentation this way. I started with lots of folk tales and fairy tales, and then the volume, I think it's called A History of Icelandic Literature, edited by Daisy Nejemin, guided me as well. And yeah, so I think just reading and having this escapist fantasy of moving to Iceland was honestly what spurred it. But the more I read, the more, yeah, these colonial complexities of the history between Denmark and Iceland started to intrigue me and pull me in. But yeah, so a very academic project that had very non-academic roots, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Okay. So our second question is, do you think you would see a similar overlap in literature from the Faroe Islands or from Greenland?
Yes, thank you for this question because now that this book is written, this is what my collaborator and I have been starting to think about, kind of a more expansive project for me to enter into. I will say that I'm only just starting to explore the Faroe Islands specific history and the literature. So I have a few that I've just ordered now, actually, from the Faroe Islands. And I've only found one, and I'm open to recommendations, but one novel, I think it's called some. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. Last Night in Nuuk, I believe. That's by this Greenlandic writer that uses a lot of very cool experimental formal techniques. And just my limited sampling, I think that it would look different and kind of the local specificities, especially to the colonial histories, would be different, but there are probably some interesting parallels using this lens for these spaces as well. So yeah, it's something I'm interested in, and yeah, if I ever come back here, I'd have more to say about, I think, in a few months. So yeah.
Well, you never know. We might just have to have you back here.
Yeah.
We have a comment that has come in, not a question, but this is from Julian. Jenna, I just thought you should know that my cat Katla absolutely responded to you mentioning the volcano.
That's amazing. Julian is in my Icelandic class and reading group, and yeah, geologist who knows much more about earthquakes specifically, but volcanoes as well. Um,
All
oh,
right, and we have another question coming. When is your Nordic Noir novel coming out?
That's my friend Dane. Hey Dane,
Yeah.
thanks for joining. Um, Probably a few years now. I'm co-writing a Nordic noir novel. It's become more like folk horror, I'll admit. We've got these shady characters who kind of resemble the Yule lads, now working their way in. So it'll probably be a while before we finish it, but I'm co-writing with a friend at Williams, and it's just a fun exercise to kind of get outside of the academic writing a bit. Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. And we have another question coming. Uh, Hi, Jenna. Congratulations on the book. I read Halder Laxness's Salka somewhat recently, and I was so struck by how Falkarian the story was. The influence felt impossible not to feel. This may be a basic question, but is there much connection between Faulkner and Iceland? And did he ever go there? And again, congratulations.
Thank you so much, John. John is a former student who's, yeah, studied Faulkner and written about Faulkner himself. And you must have joined a little late because I had a whole spiel at the beginning that Faulkner was a cultural ambassador to Iceland in 1955. But interestingly, and I didn't talk about this, he never met Laxness. So even though they kind of inhabited similar worlds and Faulkner was in Iceland and both of them were trying to be screenwriters in Hollywood, well, Faulkner succeeding. But yeah, their paths didn't actually cross. But I totally agree with you. My collaborator, Hilkar, and I are working on an article that's looking at Salka actually with Sanctuary in terms of a Faulkner novel. They came out in the same year. Don't quote me on it. I want to say 1920. But yeah, around then. And just looking at depictions of sexual violence towards young female characters that are told through ellipses, through silences, through absence. So yeah, I think there's definitely something there, John. Thanks for pointing that out.
And we have a question from Toby. I would argue Stella Blomqvist is the most well-known author because of the TV show on Sundance Now and Amazon Prime. But does that count when they are anonymous?
Ooh. I would argue probably doesn't count if they're anonymous, but that is super intriguing. I have seen that show, but a while ago. I didn't realize it was by an anonymous writer. But okay, I'll give you that could be perhaps with, yeah, at least equal with Shown, perhaps for the most famous or infamous Icelandic writers at the moment. Yeah, interesting.
And we have one more question. Do you feel like Faulkner was slumming it as a screenwriter? And if so, I read that in preparation for today, Laxness was motivated to work in Hollywood, but it never materialized, which seems kind of ironic given Laxness's socialism. What are your thoughts on this?
Great question. And I see it's from another former student slash Faulknerian, Alex Miller. Yeah, I think the way that Faulkner talks about his time as a screenwriter, you would think he was slumming it, even though he was quite successful and everything. But he talked about it like it was horrible that he would have to do that and that he was really selling out, that he needed the money. So from that perspective, yeah, perhaps. And then Laxness was motivated to work in Hollywood, but it never materialized. Yeah, yeah, given Laxness's socialism. Um, yeah, I mean, that could be a whole book in itself, I think. But yeah, I do see the irony there, and I think Laxness did have different phases throughout his life, so I think I'd need more of the timing for his stint in Hollywood, though I do know it's I think late 20s, 28, 27, 28. But interestingly with Laxness's time in Hollywood, it had a screenplay that Salka actually started as an excerpt of a screenplay. So that novel, I think it was called The Woman in Pants. Austa Christine Benningsdottir, the Icelandic scholar, has written about it. And yeah, it didn't become a screenplay. The movie was never made, but some interesting connections between the Hollywood origins and the novel that we later have too. Yeah. So thanks for that, Alex.
Okay. Now, one of the things you mentioned in your presentation was the idea of the strong woman. And
Hmm.
can you talk a little bit about the similarities or differences in how they're portrayed between the southern U.S. and the Icelandic colonization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it definitely depends on which novels, and I do see a difference of um, yeah, kind of the subject positions of the writers. So when you have a strong woman, for instance, let's take Salka Valka being written by Halder Laxness, or one of Faulkner's protagonists, we'll stick with Sanctuary, Temple Drake. Um, yeah, I mean, I almost find more difference with that because they're written interestingly, but these writers don't really attempt too much to get within the mind of the, at least I guess that goes more for Faulkner, of the woman protagonist. Whereas yeah, something written by a woman, specifically I'd say Frida Sigurdsdottir's Night Watch. It's more chaotic, but the strong woman, we're inside her mind more. We kind of are part of her in a way that I think some of the earlier strong women characters by the white male writers were not as kind of in their mindset. So yeah, more of the framing, but the cultures themselves, yeah, I mean, I think that also depends on not to sidestep the question by saying that it depends which novel, but the time period. So when Faulkner was writing in a lot of his characters in early 20th century, yeah, you do have kind of um yeah. Okay. So if I'll go maybe perhaps with Salka Valka and Carsten McCullers. So two writers writing around the same period, Laxness to Salka Valka. And there are parallels, there are similarities between the expectations of how both the strong women in these spaces have to perform, to dress. We have in Carson McCullers the quote tomboys are wearing shorts as opposed to pants, but it's very much yeah, I see some overlap in how they're being forced to present in a way that perhaps doesn't align with how they're feeling. And yeah, just yeah, I don't know. This I think I'll stop there, but there's a lot there that both intersects, but I think is interestingly distinct as well. And more so when we look at novels that were written in the same period, I'd argue. But yeah, so that was a lot. But in summary, I think it matters kind of the subject position of the writer writing the strong woman, and then the time period in the exact location that I'm comparing. So yeah, I mean, that gives you a little glimpse inside my head of how some of these comparisons come about and what I'm thinking about, I guess. Yeah. So.
All right, thank you. And Amber, I saw you nodding your head during Jenna's answer. Do you have would you like to answer any or add to that in any way? And remember, you're on mute.
It doesn't have to be Icelandic and U.S. Southern, because I know those aren't your specialties. Strong women characters and how they're written in general, perhaps.
Well, I focus mostly on rhetoric, but I do appreciate again when strong women are written by strong women. So and that's why I was nodding, right? Like again, the positionality of a writer for me is very important in sort of again thinking about how words work in relation to audience. Not to say that, you know, one couldn't write from a positionality outside of oneself, but the particularities of positionality are really important. So. Yeah, absolutely.
Good point. It actually makes me think. So in the paper where we're looking at Laxness and Faulkner, their perspectives of um, female writers, and they're kind of complexly writing about sexual violence towards young women as well. So,
Yeah.
but I think that might be why they use the ellipses and the silences, because it's difficult for them to hit the subject directly, maybe.
Directly, right. And maybe they're signaling, in fact, right, that it's that their own understanding of it is perhaps inadequate. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we are out of questions. So if anybody has a last question to pose, please do so now. But I would just like to thank Amber and Jenna for sharing their time and their knowledge with us today. This has just been really interesting. And you know, like I said, we may have to have you back after your next books are published. But as we're wrapping up, I'd just like to take a few minutes to tell everybody about what we have coming up within the INLUS. On April 15th, after the people in the US have finished their taxes, we will have a webinar with Jon Thor Viglenson, who's the Public Relations Director for Iceland Search and Rescue, aka ICESAR. And he will introduce us to the organization and all that it is responsible for. You know, if you read or hear anything about Iceland these days, chances are you've heard of Iceland Search and Rescue. They seem to be involved in just about every situation and emergency that comes up. So I think this will be a really interesting presentation to get to know a little bit more about the organization and those who are part of it and things like that. Jon Thor will be joining us from Iceland. So the webinar is going to be early. It's going to start at noon Eastern Daylight Time. And I'd also like to put in a plug for our INLUS spring Icelandic language classes. They start Monday, but the registration is still open and there still are some slots available. Information on the classes along with the registration can be found at inlus.org. So again, thank you so much, Jenna and Amber. It's been just a pleasure to have you with us tonight. And I want to also thank all those who have attended tonight for giving us your time to participate. So thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.